Hi guys, welcome to Platitude once again. Today we're going to talk imperialism. Now, just to be clear, I'm talking about American expansionism and American imperialism, not the big, imperialistic tendencies of all the major countries in the world. We're focusing on American. So, background of American imperialism. The roots of this imperialism can be traced back as far as antebellum United States. The Gilded Age, however, is the real transitory period between the idea of a continental empire or manifest destiny and the insular, which means consisting of islands, American empire of the early 20th century and today. Just saying. For these purposes, I'm going to qualify that the Gilded Age is the period from 1877 to 1893, and during this time, Americans were overly concerned with domestic issues arising from the rapid expansion of industrialism and capitalism. External threats took a back seat. We were really focused and self-centered. Well, that doesn't mean that people at the time didn't consider that at all. It just wasn't the most important. At the same time as all of this domestic upheaval, there was still this American need for adventure and opportunity and commerce and missionary work. And the U.S. needed new frontiers to assert the country's manliness, as many were afraid of a softening or feminization of the country, especially with the close of our own frontier. So being able to go off into the wild showed how manly we were, or how manly men were. I don't really know exactly what that means, but it became part of our American identity, this idea of conquering nature and conquering adventure. We also wanted new resources to build upon our ever-expanding economy. We wanted new markets in which to sell all of these manufactured goods that we're now making in our own industrial revolution. We wanted to spread Christianity to the heathen cultures of the world. Just like with White Man's Burden. All of these things are listed in White Man's Burden, right? So, the two sides of domestic versus foreign issues warred with each other in both the legislative and executive branches of government. So this constant battle led to a series of stops and starts in imperialistic fervor. Eventually, we became more and more disposed to intervene within our own hemisphere. President Harrison and Secretary of State Blaine moved decisively to exert some presence and control over the Pacific Basin and the Caribbean. Specifically designing the Pan-American Conference, Blaine set up a series of loose treaties that acted in an almost big sister capacity to the lesser Latin American countries, lesser being in quotations. While the accepted view of American expansionism is that it was a mantle thrust upon an unwilling country, an aberration of our history even, some revisionists believe it was more than that. While most agree that economic necessity and military growth was a huge part of American imperialism, some believe it was the ideas of Darwin that played a role. Darwin's theories during the Gilded Age had been applied to social structures. You've heard of social Darwinism. This is the idea that if you worked hard and had the required smarts, you would succeed within the constructs of capitalism. The other side of this states that if you didn't succeed, then it was because you were too stupid or too lazy, and it basically became this idea of survival of the fittest amongst social classes. It became Americans' own version of a caste system. Now take these same ideas of culling the herd and apply it on a global scale. Now it is the strongest countries survive, and America was subjected to a sort of global peer pressure of sorts. The number one in the country in the world, Britain, began snatching up huge chunks of land all over the world. And Germany began showing how to use the modern military force, how it could increase global power, making it the number one emerging military power in the world. Germany. This was turn of the 20th century. Do we see where this is going? Russia was almost a quiet giant. It had mass amounts of land and resources that worried many. Its power was only understated because of, major internal political turmoil. Italy was starting to make some noise. the French became very wary of this. So the USA, being the #1 growing economy at the time, many of the major world powers kept watch on our progress to see how we would utilize that economic growth. Were we going to start engaging in the land grab? Many felt that if we were to compete on the global scale, we must also begin increasing our outside holdings, i.e. taking over colonies. So we had this idea of basically everyone else was doing it, and we felt compelled to engage in the land race. Now, these foreign relations that had begun in the Gilded Age culminated in the 1890s. So this decade showed a quickening of diplomatic activity, indicating an emergence of Americans taking notice of external events. By the 1890s, Americans were acutely aware of our emerging power. And this will lead to the development of American Jingoism. Now, in case you haven't ever heard the term Jingoism, it's the context of the coining of Jingoism was British foreign policy of the late 1870s, and the Prime Minister, Disraeli, favored sending gunboats to halt the advance of the Russian fleets out of their own waters into the Mediterranean. So this gave rise to a music hall song written in 1878 with the refrain going, "We don't want to fight yet by Jingo! If we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, and got the money too." I don't know what the tune is. I tried to find it, so that's all you get. But opponents of the policy picked up on the word jingo and used it as an icon of blind patriotism. So jingoism is extreme patriotism. It's America. It's that idea. Never seeing any fault with your country. Strangely, with this new confidence in our might also came an increasing paranoia of external threats. So this is one of the roots of nativist beliefs against immigrants of any kind, and most especially against immigrants from Southeast Asian countries like China, Japan, and the Philippines. Many men also felt a rising urge to prove their manliness. Remember, I talked about this. It's adventure, this conquering. So after the Panic of 1893, many men were left unemployed with no means to support their family. Add to this the social movement of women's rights to political participation, the increasing tide of immigration and urbanization, and the widening gap between classes. Men felt they had no means in which to distinguish themselves, no way to prove that they were as good as everyone else. So this caused many to re-examine the U.S. tendency towards isolationism. Because many felt America was no longer free from foreign threat, the government began building a modern military machine. So enter Alfred T. Mahan, author of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Super important guy. He convinced many in power to build a stronger navy whose capabilities exceeded coastal defense and instead ensured the U.S. prosperity by keeping trade routes and sea lanes open, whether at war or not. Now, this is a huge deviation from traditional American thought. Think back to Jefferson. Jefferson believed in a defensive navy only. Do not expand. But Alfred T. Mahan writes this book and basically states that he who has the greatest sea power controls the world. So this will become very influential for many, many American leaders. As before, Americans began to look for new territory to help fight internal problems. After the Panic of 1893, the USA began looking for new markets. America became obsessed with the idea that foreign trade and markets were the only way to avoid an economic downturn in the future. To aid in that line of thinking, an Isthmian canal was necessary to survival, and the U.S. began shopping around. Just so you know, an Isthmian canal is on the Isthmus of Central America, that tiny little part, the skinny part that connects the two continents. So what's going to happen is we're going to start looking for a canal that we're going to own within another country. Another argument led to the increasing acceptance of imperialism. Rudyard Kipling's idea of the white man's burden became a popular idea to spread Western civilization to the less fortunate barbarian people of the world. Got to take care of those unfortunate barbarian people. And many will use this racist idea of Anglo-Saxonism to justify the imposition of U.S. rule on a backward people. This can be seen early on in the bullying of Haiti and Santo Domingo for naval bases, the bellicose or warlike interactions in Chile, the heavy-handed annexation of Hawaii, the blustery intervention in Venezuela, and of course, the Spanish-American War that led directly into the war with Philippines. So, just to kind of go briefly over the things I just discussed, in Chile had begun throwing significant weight around along the South American coastline using a modern navy. This made many in Latin America nervous, and many more in the U.S. indignant and wary. Hostilities between Chile and the USA increased when 2 American sailors were killed during their time in Latin America. The U.S., in a show of force, felt compelled to shut down the upstart Chilean Navy. Those crazy Chileans. They then forced Chile to pay an indemnity. So here's the crazy thing. 2 American sailors were killed in Chile. And then, so the U.S. shut down the Chilean Navy, and they forced them to pay. That's, well, you know, but we could do it. We had the power to do it. Hawaii, even in the early 19th century, Hawaii was considered a magical tropical haven. It was also often used as a way station in the Pacific for U.S. sailors, shippers, and whalers. And in 1820, New England missionaries came to Hawaii preaching Protestant Christianity, bringing Christianity to the brown people. By the turn of the century, Honolulu looked similar to a typical New England town rather than a tropical native village. Easing the white man's burden was not the only reason, though, that people looked at Hawaii with a speculative gleam. Many saw Hawaii as a virtual extension of the western coast of the U.S., despite it being like 3,000 miles away, but whatever. American economic control of Hawaii tightened in 1875 with commercial reciprocity, encouraging the growing of sugar cultivation for American consumption. In 1887, the U.S. was granted the right to build a naval base in Pearl Harbor, which will later play a pivotal role in annexation. Also, by the 1890s, the McKinley Tariff had soured sugar sales. What I mean by that is, that McKinley Tariff had created such a high cost to sugar, to importing sugar from other countries, that they had raised the price so much nobody was buying it. So Americans started looking for a way around that tariff, and no place in mainland United States can grow sugar unless you want to do it very expensively or with a hothouse, right? A greenhouse, which is way too expensive. You can't mass produce it, and when you don't mass produce something, it costs too much. So they were looking for a way to get around that tariff. So now, America has a social and religious reason, an economic, and a military interest in Hawaii. So this bad boy, this island is as good as ours. Annexation is the most likely next step, especially when white settlers, in conjunction with Marines stationed at Pearl Harbor, you know, the naval base that they allowed us to build, engage in a government coup that will unset the Hawaiian queen, Queen Lilikulani, who I am now from this point on going to call Queen Lil because I am afraid that I am butchering her actual name. So these settlers, now firmly in control of the government, will immediately apply for annexation. When it was originally applied for, annexation was thwarted by Cleveland, the president, who, through some secret detective work performed by his Secretary of State, found that, guess what, most Hawaiians didn't want to be part of the U.S. That is a feeling that hasn't really changed for quite a few Hawaiians. So, you know, Hawaii would remain a republic until 1898, when the U.S. would annex under McKinley, under a different president, in the midst of the Spanish-American War. Now, let's talk about Venezuela. Venezuela was a conflict that flared in 1895 to 1896 between Venezuela and British-owned New Guinea regarding the disputed jungle boundary between the two countries. This dispute grew more heated Because guess what? Gold was found in the disputed territory. So President Cleveland decides to get involved using the Monroe Doctrine. Now remember, the Monroe Doctrine was made 100 years earlier. Well, not 100, but like 80 years earlier. And, excuse me, and it basically said that other countries couldn't get involved in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. Of course, it was only enforced by the British, who were now using it against. Because we didn't have the kind of navy that could enforce it. Okay, so Cleveland goes in. And he and his Secretary of State decide to send a blistering note to Britain called the 20-inch gun blast. Not kidding. In which America warns Britain that they are in violation of the Monroe Doctrine because Britain was trying to dominate Venezuela. So he basically throws down the gauntlet and tells Britain that the U.S. is in control in the Western Hemisphere. Now the British are like, I know. I don't think so. Because the British are like, we're number one. We're the number one ranked navy in the world. Suck it. Right? And they're also the foremost imperial power because they engaged in that land race as seriously. They considered us, the U.S., their lowly country cousin of sorts, and are incredulous at our arrogance and temerity. Yes, big words. They essentially ignore us and tell us to butt out. To Cleveland, it is like Britain told us, turned to us when he sent his letter, his very mean letter, and said, what are you going to do about it? So Cleveland gets angry and applies to Congress to give him the means to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, which means building up a military, a navy specifically. Thankfully, the Germans began making trouble for Britain off the coast of South Africa, I guess thankfully, distracting British attention. So since Germany was seen as a greater threat, Britain agrees to sit down to arbitration with the U.S. So we don't actually have to go to war over Venezuela to enforce the Monroe Doctrine against the British. So here's the major problem. Neither America nor Britain had any real respect for the Venezuelans. So guess what? Venezuela wasn't invited. Venezuela is fighting over the land, and they weren't invited. So this angers Venezuela and adds to the growing Latin American concern regarding the Colossus of the North. That would be us. On the upside, the incident will begin a new era of Anglo-American cordiality that will be a cornerstone in each country's foreign policy. Because what ends up happening is the U.S., they sit down with the British without the Venezuelans and basically say, oh, you know what, you're such a nice guy, and you make a reasonable request, and you say it in English, and it's well written, and, you know, you're not brown. So we're going to go ahead and give you that disputed territory that has gold in it. We're friends now, right? Awesome! Yeah, so Venezuela, just so you know, still hates us. This is where it starts. They still hate us. Maybe not as much as they did, but they still hate us. Alright, so at this point, this is all leading up to the Spanish-American War, and the Spanish-American War we'll talk about in school, but all of this comes together. All of this culminates. This is the beginning of American expansionism, or imperialism, that is still around today. We still have colonies. We are the only